Winter had settled in with its icy grip, covering everything in snow. Lucy and her friends were headed to an isolated cabin deep in the woods for a weekend getaway. It was supposed to be a relaxing trip, away from the bustle of the city. The cabin was miles away from civilization, surrounded by nothing but dense trees and the eerie silence of the frozen wilderness. As they drove deeper into the forest, the trees seemed to close in around them, their dark silhouettes looming against the pale sky. The further they went, the more uneasy Lucy became. The cabin was located at the end of a narrow, winding road that seemed almost forgotten by time. No cell service, no neighbors for miles, just the five of them and the harsh wilderness. When they finally arrived, the cabin looked much older than they expected. Its wooden frame creaked with age, and the windows were clouded with frost. But it was warm inside, and the group quickly settled in, lighting the fireplace and unpacking their bags. The plan was simple: relax, tell stories, and enjoy the isolation. But as night fell, strange things began to happen. Lucy noticed footprints in the snow outside the cabin, footprints that didn't belong to anyone in the group. They were too large, too deep, and they led off into the trees, disappearing into the darkness. She tried to brush it off, but the feeling of being watched never left her. The following morning, the group awoke to an unsettling discovery. The footprints from the night before had multiplied, circling the cabin as if someone or something had been watching them all night. The tension in the cabin grew as the group discussed whether to stay or leave. "It's probably just a hunter," Jake said, trying to sound confident. But even he couldn't hide the fear in his voice. Lucy couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. As the day wore on, strange noises echoed from the woods, branches snapping, low growls, and the sound of something heavy moving through the snow. The group huddled together inside the cabin, trying to convince themselves it was just the wind. But as night fell again, the sounds grew louder, more insistent. And then, just as they were sitting down for dinner, there was a loud knock at the door. Everyone froze. "Who could that be?" Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. No one wanted to answer the door, but the knocking continued, louder and more forceful. Finally, Jake stood up and cautiously opened it. There was no one there, just the cold wind and the endless dark. But when he looked down, he saw something that made his blood run cold. Fresh footprints, leading away from the door and disappearing into the woods. Lucy's unease had turned into full-blown terror. She couldn't shake the feeling that something evil was lurking in the woods, watching them. Desperate for answers, she began searching through the cabin, hoping to find something that could explain the strange occurrences. That's when she stumbled upon an old journal, hidden beneath the floorboards. The journal belonged to a man named Henry Larson, who had lived in the cabin with his family decades ago. The entries were scattered, but one thing was clear: Henry's family had disappeared under mysterious circumstances. The more Lucy read, the more she realized that the same strange noises, the same footprints, had plagued Henry's family before they vanished. "They come at night," Henry had written in one of the final entries. "They watch from the trees. They wait until you're alone, and then they strike." Lucy's heart raced as she read the last entry. "I fear tonight will be our last. If anyone finds this, beware the woods." She hurried back to the group, her hands trembling as she showed them the journal. "We need to leave," she said, her voice shaking. "Whatever happened to this family, it's happening to us." Panic set in as the group debated whether to leave the cabin immediately or wait until morning. The storm outside had worsened, and the roads were completely covered in snow. Leaving now meant braving the dangerous terrain in total darkness. But staying felt even more dangerous. Just as they were arguing, the sound of breaking glass shattered the silence. The group ran to the living room, where the window had been smashed open, snow blowing in through the broken pane. Jake grabbed a flashlight and shone it outside, his hands shaking. That's when they saw it, a figure standing at the edge of the woods, barely visible through the swirling snow. It was tall, much taller than any human, and its eyes glowed red in the darkness. As the light hit it, the figure let out a low, guttural growl and disappeared into the trees. The group scrambled to block the broken window, but the fear in the cabin was palpable. They knew now that they weren't dealing with a person. they were dealing with something far worse. The night was long, filled with the sounds of scratching at the walls and heavy footsteps on the roof. Whatever was out there, it wasn't going to let them leave easily. By morning, the storm had died down, but the tension in the cabin had only grown. The group packed their bags, ready to leave as soon as possible. But as they stepped outside, they realized the road was completely blocked by snow. They would have to hike out on foot. With no other choice, they set off into the woods, hoping to find help. The forest was eerily quiet, the only sound being the crunch of snow beneath their feet. But as they made their way deeper into the trees, they realized they weren't alone. The growling started again, low and menacing, coming from all directions. Lucy's heart pounded as she glanced around, trying to see where the sound was coming from. But the woods were thick, and the snow made it hard to see more than a few feet ahead. Then out of nowhere, the creature appeared, barreling toward them through the trees. It was massive, covered in matted fur, with glowing red eyes and long, sharp claws. The group scattered, running in different directions as the creature gave chase. Lucy ran as fast as she could, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. She could hear the creature behind her, its heavy footsteps growing closer and closer. Just as she thought it would catch her, she stumbled upon an old, abandoned cabin, hidden deep in the woods. She threw herself inside, slamming the door behind her and locking it. The creature let out a furious roar, pounding on the door with its massive claws. But the door held, and after what felt like hours, the creature finally retreated. Lucy was safe, for now. Inside the abandoned cabin, Lucy found herself alone. She had lost the others in the chase, and there was no way to know if they had made it out alive. The cabin was cold and dark, but at least it was shelter from the creature that had been stalking them. But as she sat there trying to catch her breath, she realized something was wrong. The cabin was eerily similar to the one they had just left. The same layout, the same furniture, even the same creaky floorboards. That's when she saw it, the same journal, sitting on the table, open to the same page. "They come at night," it read. "They watch from the trees. They wait until you're alone. And then they strike." Lucy's blood ran cold. This wasn't just any cabin. It was the Larson cabin, the very place where the family had vanished all those years ago. The door creaked open, and Lucy turned to see the creature standing in the doorway, its red eyes glowing in the darkness. There was no escape this time. The creature let out a deafening roar and lunged at her, its claws outstretched. And then, everything went black. Lily had always wanted a fresh start, a place where she could escape the noise of the city and the chaos of her life. When she found Cedar Lodge, a quaint cabin nestled deep in the woods, it seemed like the perfect opportunity. The price was suspiciously low, but Lily didn't care. She signed the papers and moved in without hesitation, eager for the solitude the cabin promised. The cabin itself was beautiful, rustic, with large windows overlooking the dense forest. It had once been a vacation home for a wealthy family, but it had stood empty for years. As Lily unpacked her belongings and settled into her new life, she couldn't help but feel a sense of peace wash over her. This was where she would rebuild her life, far away from the noise and the crowds. But as night fell, that sense of peace began to unravel. The woods surrounding the cabin were deathly quiet. Not even the sound of birds or insects could be heard. The only noise was the occasional creak of the old cabin settling, and the wind whispering through the trees. Lily tried to ignore it, chalking it up to the unfamiliar sounds of her new home. But when she heard footsteps outside her window, heavy and deliberate, she couldn't ignore the growing unease that crept over her. She rushed to the window and peered out into the darkness, but saw nothing. The woods were still, almost too still, as if they were holding their breath. Shaking off the feeling, she closed the curtains and locked the doors, telling herself it was just her imagination. After all, she was in the middle of nowhere. There was no one else around for miles, or so she thought. The following day, Lily decided to explore the area surrounding her new home. The forest was thick and dense, with towering trees that seemed to stretch endlessly into the sky. As she wandered deeper into the woods, She stumbled upon a small, overgrown path that led to a clearing. In the center of the clearing stood an old, dilapidated cabin, its roof sagging and windows shattered. Curiosity got the better of her, and Lily approached the cabin. The door was hanging off its hinges, and the inside was a mess of broken furniture and debris. It looked like no one had set foot in the place for years. But as she stepped inside, she felt a sudden chill run down her spine, as if the temperature had dropped several degrees. There was something unsettling about the cabin, something she couldn't quite put her finger on. It felt wrong, like it didn't belong there. As she turned to leave, she noticed a name carved into the doorframe: Cedar Lodge. Confused, she stared at the words, her heart beginning to race. Why would there be two cabins with the same name? Shaking off the eerie feeling, she hurried back to her cabin, determined to forget about the strange discovery. But that night, as she lay in bed, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching her. The air in the cabin felt thick, oppressive, as if the walls were closing in around her. And then, the footsteps started again. Slow, deliberate, and this time, they were inside the house. Lily bolted upright in bed, her heart pounding in her chest. The footsteps were unmistakable, echoing through the halls of the cabin. She grabbed the flashlight from her nightstand and crept out of bed, the beam of light shaking in her trembling hand. As she tiptoed through the cabin, her breath caught in her throat when she saw the front door standing wide open, swaying gently in the breeze. Panic surged through her. She was certain she had locked it before going to bed. Her mind raced with possibilities. Was there someone in the house with her? Or something else? She stepped outside, the cold night air biting at her skin. The forest was pitch black, and she could barely make out the path that led to the other cabin in the clearing. Her instincts screamed at her to run back inside, lock the doors, and wait for morning. But something compelled her to follow the footsteps that seemed to lead toward the clearing. When she reached the dilapidated cabin, she was shocked to find it completely intact. The roof was no longer sagging, the windows were whole, and the inside was neat, as if someone had been living there. In the dim moonlight, she saw a figure standing in the doorway, a woman, her face obscured by shadows. Lily's breath caught in her throat. "Who are you?" she called out, her voice trembling. The woman didn't respond. Instead, she slowly raised her hand and pointed back toward Lily's cabin. Without thinking, Lily turned and ran, her heart pounding in her ears. When she finally reached her cabin, she slammed the door shut and locked it, her hands shaking uncontrollably. But as she leaned against the door, trying to catch her breath, she realized something was terribly wrong. The cabin was no longer hers. The next few days passed in a blur of fear and confusion. Every time Lily tried to leave, something would stop her. The car wouldn't start, the roads were blocked by fallen trees, and the weather seemed to turn against her. It was as if the cabin didn't want her to leave. But the worst part was the constant feeling of being watched. No matter where she went in the house, she could feel eyes on her, following her every move. The footsteps continued, growing louder and more insistent each night, as if whoever or whatever was inside the cabin with her was getting closer. One night she woke to the sound of whispering. It was faint at first, like the wind rustling through the trees, but it grew louder, more distinct. The voices were coming from the walls, the floors, even the ceiling, all around her. They were calling her name, urging her to come outside, to go back to the other cabin. Desperate for answers, Lily turned to the old records she had found in the cabin's attic when she first moved in. Among them was a newspaper clipping from the 1950s, detailing the mysterious disappearance of a family who had once lived in Cedar Lodge. According to the article, the family had vanished without a trace, leaving behind only their empty home and a series of strange, unsolved mysteries. The whispers grew louder as she read, until they were almost deafening, and then, just as suddenly as they had started, they stopped. Lily was alone again, or so she thought. Determined to get to the bottom of the mystery, Lily ventured back to the other cabin in the clearing. This time she brought a flashlight and a sense of purpose. If she was going to uncover the truth, she needed to face her fears head-on. As she approached the cabin, she noticed something strange. There were no footprints in the snow. It was as if no one had been there for years, despite the fact that she had seen the cabin restored and intact just days earlier. Inside, the cabin was once again in ruins, its walls crumbling and its furniture covered in dust. But there, in the center of the room, was a single object that hadn't been there before. An old mirror, its surface cracked and covered in grime. Lily approached the mirror, her heart pounding. As she wiped away the dust, her reflection stared back at her. Except, it wasn't her reflection at all. The woman in the mirror was the same one she had seen standing in the doorway that night. And then, the woman spoke. "You can't leave," she whispered, her voice echoing in Lily's mind. "The cabin won't let you." Lily stumbled back, her mind racing. The pieces were finally starting to fall into place. The woman in the mirror was one of the original owners of Cedar Lodge, trapped in the cabin by the same curse that now held Lily captive. The cabin wasn't just haunted. It was alive, feeding on the fear and despair of those who entered it. And now it had claimed Lily as its next victim. With the truth finally revealed, Lily knew she had to escape, no matter what it took. She gathered her belongings and made one final attempt to leave the cabin, determined not to let it consume her like it had the others. As she stepped outside, the wind howled through the trees, and the ground beneath her feet seemed to shift and move. The cabin loomed behind her, its windows glowing with an eerie light, as if it were watching her every move. But Lily didn't look back. She ran, her breath coming in short gasps as she sprinted through the forest, the branches tearing at her clothes and the cold air stinging her skin. The whispers followed her, growing louder with every step, urging her to turn back, to come home. But she didn't stop. She pushed through the fear, the exhaustion, and the cold, until she finally broke through the trees and stumbled onto the road. For the first time in days, she saw a car approaching in the distance. She waved her arms frantically, tears streaming down her face as the vehicle came to a stop. The driver, a kind-looking man in his 50s, rolled down the window and looked at her with concern. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice gentle. Lily nodded, too exhausted to speak. She climbed into the car and collapsed in the passenger seat, grateful to finally be free of the cabin's grasp. As they drove away, Lily looked back at the woods one last time. The cabin was nowhere to be seen, hidden once again among the trees, waiting for its next victim. Lily knew the truth now. Cedar Lodge was no ordinary cabin. It was a trap, a prison for those who dared to seek solace in its walls, and she had barely escaped with her life. When Mike and his friends planned their weekend getaway, they wanted something remote, something far from the hustle and bustle of the city. When they found a cabin on a rental website called The Cabin in the Forgotten Woods, it seemed like the perfect choice. The website's pictures showed a rustic, cozy cabin surrounded by dense forests and a sparkling lake nearby. The price was surprisingly low, but they figured it was because it was off-season for tourists. Excited for a quiet weekend of fishing, bonfires, and beer, the group of 5 friends set off in Mike's SUV. It was a long drive, with the paved road eventually giving way to a narrow dirt track that wound through a thick forest. The deeper they drove into the woods, the darker and denser the trees became. Even though it was still late afternoon, the thick canopy overhead blocked out much of the sunlight. As they approached the cabin, an uneasy feeling settled over them. The cabin was much older than the photos had suggested. The wood was weathered and splintering, and the windows were clouded with grime. The place looked as though it hadn't been lived in for years, but Mike and his friends shrugged it off. They were there for an adventure, and the eerie atmosphere only added to the thrill of being out in the wilderness. "Well, it's got character," joked Sarah, Mike's girlfriend, as they unloaded the car. "Yeah, if by character you mean haunted house vibe," replied Dave, one of Mike's childhood friends, laughing nervously. As they settled in, the inside of the cabin proved to be just as dusty and run down as the outside. But they weren't there for luxury. They were there for fun. They unpacked their gear, cracked open some beers, and started a fire in the cabin's old stone fireplace. By the time night fell, the group was laughing and enjoying themselves, the initial unease forgotten. But as the fire crackled and the wind howled outside, strange noises began to fill the cabin. Faint footsteps echoed from the hallways, though everyone was seated in the main room. Occasionally, the floorboards would creak as if someone or something was walking across them. "Must be the house settling," Mike said, trying to calm the growing sense of dread. But deep down, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was off about this place. The first night in the cabin was restless for everyone. Around 2 a.m., Sarah jolted awake. She wasn't sure what had woken her at first, but then she heard it. A faint whispering. It was coming from outside the bedroom window, low and unintelligible, like someone muttering under their breath. She strained to listen, her heart pounding in her chest. "Mike," she whispered, shaking him awake. "Do you hear that?" Mike groggily sat up, rubbing his eyes. "Hear what?" "Listen." For a moment they both sat in silence, and then the whispers came again, louder this time. It was as if someone was right outside their window, speaking in hushed tones. But when Mike looked out, there was nothing there, just the dark, empty woods. "It's probably the wind," Mike muttered, trying to calm Sarah and himself. But as he lay back down, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, watching them. The next morning, the group gathered around the kitchen table, exchanging stories of their own restless nights. Each of them had heard something: whispers, footsteps, creaking floors, even scratching sounds on the walls. But no one could explain it. "Maybe this place is haunted," joked Dave. But there was an edge to his voice. "You know, old cabins in the middle of nowhere. Who knows what kind of creepy stuff has happened here?" They all laughed nervously, but the unease in the air was palpable. Even the sunlight streaming through the windows couldn't banish the feeling that they weren't alone. They decided to spend the day outside, hoping that fresh air and sunshine would lift their spirits. They hiked around the lake, fished for a few hours, and had a picnic on the shore. But as the day wore on, they couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The forest was too quiet, the air too still. Not even the birds were singing. By the time they returned to the cabin that evening, the unease had grown into a gnawing fear. And as night fell, the whispers returned. Only this time, they weren't just outside. The whispers that night were louder, more persistent. They echoed through the halls and seemed to come from all directions. No matter where they went in the cabin, the voices followed them, growing louder as the night wore on. It was as if the walls themselves were alive, speaking in low, guttural tones that none of them could understand. "Enough of this," Mike shouted at one point, storming out into the hallway. "This is ridiculous. There's no one here." But as soon as he said it, the lights flickered, plunging the cabin into momentary darkness. When they came back on, the whispering had stopped. Shaken, the group huddled in the main room, trying to make sense of what was happening. Sarah, her hands trembling, pulled out her phone and started searching for any information about the cabin. After a few minutes, she found an old article from a local newspaper, dated back nearly 50 years. The article detailed the mysterious disappearance of a family who had once lived in the cabin. According to the report, the family had moved to the cabin for a fresh start, just like Mike and his friends. But within weeks, strange things began to happen. Unexplained noises, whispers in the night, and sightings of shadowy figures in the woods. And then one night, the entire family vanished without a trace. "Great," muttered Dave, running a hand through his hair. "We're staying in a cursed cabin." Mike shook his head. "That doesn't mean anything. People disappear all the time in the woods. It's probably just some old superstition." But as the night wore on, it became harder to dismiss the cabin's dark past. The whispering returned, louder and more insistent than before. And now they could hear footsteps, soft but unmistakable, moving through the cabin as if someone, or something, was walking among them. As the days passed, the group became more and more convinced that they weren't alone. During the day, they would see shadowy figures darting between the trees, always just out of sight. At night, the whispers would return, growing louder and more aggressive with each passing hour. Sleep became impossible. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind, every rustle of leaves outside sent their hearts racing. They tried to leave, but every time they packed their things and headed toward the car, something would stop them. A flat tire, a tree fallen across the road, or the engine refusing to start. It was as if the cabin itself was keeping them there. One night, after hours of listening to the whispers and the footsteps, Sarah had enough. "I'm leaving," she declared, grabbing her coat and heading for the door. "You can't go out there," Mike shouted, grabbing her arm. "It's the middle of the night." "I don't care," she snapped, pulling away from him. "I can't stay in here another minute." Before anyone could stop her, Sarah stormed out into the darkness, her flashlight beam cutting through the thick fog that had settled over the woods. The others watched her go, too frightened to follow. For a few moments, everything was silent, and then a blood-curdling scream echoed through the woods, followed by the unmistakable sound of running footsteps, heavy, desperate, and fast. Mike and the others rushed outside, but Sarah was gone. They called her name, their voices breaking with fear, but there was no answer. All they could hear was the whispering, growing louder and louder until it filled their heads, driving them back inside the cabin. The disappearance of Sarah shattered whatever fragile grip on reality the group had left. Mike, racked with guilt and fear, became obsessed with finding her. He would spend hours staring out the windows, watching the woods for any sign of movement. But no matter how hard he looked, Sarah never returned. Meanwhile, the others began to crack under the pressure. Dave started talking to himself, muttering under his breath as if he were conversing with someone unseen. Jenny, another friend, refused to leave her room, convinced that something was hiding in the walls, watching her every move. The whispering grew louder and more frequent, sometimes so deafening that it was impossible to think. And then came the footsteps, always just behind them, always too close for comfort. One night, after a particularly loud and terrifying bout of whispering, Mike snapped. "I can't take this anymore," he shouted, grabbing an axe from the fireplace and swinging it wildly at the walls. "I'll kill whatever's in here with us." But as the axe hit the walls, it was as if the cabin itself retaliated. The floor beneath Mike buckled, sending him crashing to the ground. The lights flickered, and the whispering grew so loud that it felt like the very air was vibrating with sound. That's when they saw it, a shadowy figure standing in the doorway, watching them with glowing, malevolent eyes. The figure in the doorway was tall and gaunt, its eyes burning with an unnatural light. As it stepped into the room, the temperature dropped, and the air became thick with the stench of decay. Mike, still clutching the axe, charged at the figure, swinging wildly, but his weapon passed through the figure as if it were made of smoke. The shadowy entity let out a low, guttural growl, and the whispering grew louder, filling the room with a cacophony of voices. The others screamed, backing away as the figure advanced, but there was nowhere to run, no escape from the cabin's malevolent grip. One by one, the friends fell to their knees, clutching their heads as the whispering overwhelmed them, driving them to the brink of madness. Mike, his vision blurred by fear and exhaustion, swung the axe again, but it was no use. The figure was everywhere and nowhere, its presence filling every corner of the room. Just when it seemed like all hope was lost, a sudden burst of light filled the room, driving the shadowy figure back. It screeched in anger, retreating into the darkness as the light grew brighter. Mike, gasping for breath, looked around. The others were still on the floor, but they were alive. The whispering had stopped, and the cabin was eerily silent once more. But they knew it wasn't over. The cabin had let them go, for now. But it was still out there, waiting in the darkness, waiting for its next victims. And as they fled into the night, Mike couldn't shake the feeling that they would never truly